Okay, well, in history today, we are now up to the third level of government. We've gone through the local government responsibilities and the state government responsibilities. And today we're up to what is the role of the federal government. Now, the federal government looks after the whole of Australia, okay? The whole of Australia in its entirety. Like we said yesterday, like I said before, there's three levels of government. We've gone through local government, local councils, state governments, and we're up to the blue one, which is all about federal government. I'm not going to go into all of these things because some of them are a little bit like not that big a deal, like lighthouses and lightships and things that's not really something we're going to go into. But we're going to look at a couple of these things and see how it is impacted by the federal government. Now, I'm trying not to use my opinions about anything to do with the federal government. I'm just trying to explain to you what their job is. Okay. And sometimes how it's changed. So the first thing is trade. The federal government's in charge of trading between other countries. So trading goods and services, mainly goods, sorry. And they have different agreements with different countries. So they might have an agreement at one stage we had an agreement with America, which was a free trade agreement, which means we didn't pay taxes on the stuff we were bringing in and out of the country. We have a lot of agreements with countries about selling them our beef and our meat and all sorts of other things because we're a big farming country, and our mining is also a big part of our trade as well. So having to talk to each individual country about what we can buy and sell from them and what price it's going to be at, and whether we can do a deal where we give them one thing and then they get something else. That's all the federal government's responsibilities, which makes sense because it impacts the whole of this country. So it makes sense that the government who's in charge of the whole country makes those decisions. Next up, sorry, I don't know if you can see that. We have Postal and Telecommunications. Now, the first thing is postal. So that means the Australia Post is run and owned by the Australian government. Now, it's really important that the postal service is run by the government because it's really important that they keep prices as low as possible. And if the government runs it, they shouldn't be running it to try to make money from it. It's a service, and it's very important that we keep the postal service going. And if people want to send letters to people and things like that, that it doesn't cost too much money and that it runs properly. It shouldn't be run by a business. Now, businesses run the stuff on the side. So the packages and the couriers and stuff like that, when you order stuff online, a lot of that stuff doesn't come through Telstra. Through Australia Post, but it's still run by the government. Okay, it's really important. Next thing I'm going to talk about is this one at the top, telecom. You would not have heard of telecom before. Now, telecom was around when I was younger, but it was around before that as well. It was there was a phone company that was owned by the government, and the government owned the phone company, so they had to pay so it helped with rural areas and stuff like that. And they sold off telecom. And at one stage, the government owned Optus as well. And it became Telstra, which was not run and owned by the government. Okay, so it used to be owned by the government, but now it's not. And the other one we have is that way, the ABC. Now, the ABC is a really, really important television station that is run by the Australian government. Sorry, not run, but it's funded by the Australian government. They don't have any choice, and they get quite upset sometimes because they want to choose what's on it. But it's funded by the Australian government. So the Australian government give money to the ABC so they can do stories that even if they don't worry too much, it's about making sure that everybody has a voice. And it's a really important station. And it's important that the government keep funding that television station. Next up, we have taxes. Now, I don't know if you guys know how much about taxes work, but basically when you work and you earn money, let's say if you earned $800 a week, a certain amount of that money, maybe $300 or so, you don't get that money. So that money goes to the government. And if everybody in Australia, all that money is going to the government, that's how the government makes money. Everything you pay in taxes pays for all the things so they can fund it, which is really great in the fact that they use it to fund our healthcare system. So because each week we pay money, instead of we get that money, we pay some of our money to the government, to the ATO, this one down here. They use that money to fund all the projects that they do. Now, some people get upset about how they spend the money, but it's really important, especially for things like Medicare and all the medical things, and making sure that we don't have to pay for schools and things like that, for public schools and stuff. It's really important that those taxes go to those sort of things. So the government, the Australian government's in charge of the ATO, which looks after all those taxes. Foreign policy. Now, foreign policy is basically how Australia interacts with other countries. Now, you can see above me, just above me, is the foreign minister. Her name is Marise Payne, and she is the Australian foreign minister at the moment. And over the other side, that way, you can see Scott Morrison, Australia's prime minister, meeting with Joe Biden, America's president, and Boris Johnson, England's prime minister too. So having relationships with other countries and how you sort of talk to them and what you're doing behind the scenes and political alliances and all those sort of things are very important for a country to make sure that they've got good foreign policy and good relationships with other countries, but it can become quite tricky. So when countries do things that you don't like and you don't want to upset them, so you don't know how to say things in public, so you're not really necessarily saying that they did a bad job because you know that you need them for trade and things like that, it becomes very tricky with foreign policy. It's very, very hard to still have friends, but then also make sure that if they do something wrong, you're calling them out on it. So it can become quite tricky. Money and budgeting. Like we said before with the taxes, once our taxes go to the government, they then make a budget of where they think the money is going to go each year. So they'll say, we're going to put this much money to this organization, this much money here, this much money here, and they table it up and they send it to Parliament and it goes through. Also, the Australian Reserve Bank, who decide the home loan rate, also is the part of the Australian government. Okay, so basically they basically are in charge of spending all that money. People have different opinions about how they should spend that money, about whether they should spend more money or they should be really cautious with the money and save it to make sure that they don't go into debt. It can be a lot of different opinions around this. Okay, so the next one's immigration. So Australian government is in charge of the immigration system, which is who is allowed to come and live in our country, who's allowed to visit our country, how long it takes to go through the process of, becoming a citizen of Australia and all of those other issues. Each government has their own policy about immigration and about how they decide to run it. And it's differed in the last 20 years between people who are trying to be more compassionate with letting in people who are fleeing countries and other people who are more strict about making sure that nobody else comes here. Each of those governments change quite dramatically sometimes between each immigration policy. But yeah. All right, next one. Defense. So Australia, the government is in charge of funding the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. So yeah, those are the responsibilities, and whether you go into wars and things like that are part of the responsibility of the Australian government. Okay, also welfare. So people getting money from the government for things like unemployment benefits if they can't find a job, making sure they can still survive. It's really important they do that, because if people are looking for work and they can't find a job and they've got kids at home, it's really important that they make sure that they can still survive. And in our society, they should be able to be looked after while they're trying to get back on their feet. Also at the moment that the Centrelink has had to come into a lot because a lot of people can't work because of what's happening at the moment. So being able to make sure that if they're told to stay home, that they can access money for that process is really important, because it's really important that they look after everyone in a society when they need help. Yeah. Also aged care. Aged care is a big one at the moment. That's really, really important. And I told you I wasn't going to give my opinion, but I kind of am. In Australia, we do not do a good enough job of looking after our aged care system. There have been a few things called royal commissions, and they look into how our aged care system runs, and our aged care system is not funded properly. There needs to be a way to fund it properly and to give more money to these institutions to make sure they can better care for these old people and elderly people and anyone who needs any sort of care, to make sure that they've got enough funding and that they've got enough staff and that the conditions are really good. And I feel like it's really important, especially because everybody's going to start getting old at some stage. And I think it's really important that we make sure that in a society, we look after our elderly people or our needy people as much as possible. So I'm hoping over the next few year or so that we'll hear a lot more about extra funding going to aged care to make sure that we fix it up, because it's very important for our society to fix up aged care. Anyway, that's all I've got time for today. I hope you've learned a lot and good luck. And yeah, have a go at the activity below. Let me know what you think. Thanks.